Alright, welcome back, guys. Still reading Shadow Ranch. Gotten kind of adventurous, scary, interesting, right? When we left off, they were looking in the spring house. A light came on in the spring house when Nancy was trying to escape being trapped in that room. Light came on, she noticed, but when she got out of the window, she hit the dog on accident. He yelped, barked, light went out. Uncle Mr. Raleigh, the owner of the ranch, came running out, and she said she saw the light. He said, okay. She goes, it went off, but nobody came out. So so the person has to be in there still. So they go and he opens the door. She places her flashlight in there, and nobody, empty. So that's how it ended. So let's continue with the secret of Shadow Ranch. Chapter 10, Hidden Entrance. I just can't believe it, Nancy exclaimed. No one could have come out. I could see the door all the while I was running towards it. Ed Raleigh looked at Nancy. I'm sure you didn't imagine seeing the light. This worries me. Nancy told him of the similar experience she had the day before. Perhaps there's a secret exit, she suggested. Using her flashlight, Nancy examined the walls of the spring house, but found they were solid adobe. It occurred to her that there might be a wooden trap door and a passageway under the earthen floor. She looked for any sign of seams in the earth. There were none. Nancy gave a baffled sigh and glanced at the stone vat. No use bothering with that, said Uncle Raleigh. It's too small to hide in and too heavy to be moved in a hurry. Whoever escapes from here does it in a twinkling. As Nancy and the rancher left the spring house, she glanced uneasily towards the meadow. The last time I saw the light, the phantom horse appeared out there, she remarked. I'll alert my men to watch for more sabotage, Uncle Ed said quickly, and I'll take one off of patrol duty to stand guard here at the spring house all night. He hurried away. Nancy stood watching the dark meadow, puzzling over the problem of the disappearing light. The phantom horse did not appear and finally returned to the house. Nancy went to the living room, lighted a lamp, and sat down alone to think over the mystery. How could someone disappear from the spring house without using the exit? Suddenly, she remembered that a prowler had done the same thing from the cellar of the house. Nancy jumped up excitedly. Of course, that's the answer, she told herself. The spring house is next to the kitchen, and the cellar is under it. There must be a hidden passage from one to the other. She hastened out of the house and around the corner, but stopped short. A shadowy figure was lounging outside of the spring house. It was Dave, on guard. Nancy decided against examining the spring house again that night. On the way back, she glanced into the kitchen. Miss Thurman was seated at the big table reading a magazine. Next to her was Bud Moore. He saw Nancy at the door. Howdy, he said. Mr. Raleigh changed me into the house guard tonight so you gals can sleep easy. That's right, thanks. Nancy smiled, but inwardly she was disappointed. Now I can't investigate the cellar either, she thought, with Bud around. Nancy awoke at dawn. She dressed quickly and slipped out of the house. To her relief, there was no longer anyone on guard at the spring house. She stepped inside and walked to the kitchen wall. Nancy lifted the lid of the vat and looked in. It was empty. Nancy knelt and began to fill the bottom of the vat. Along the front edge, her fingers suddenly encountered a piece of cord and opposite another piece. Nancy pulled on them and the bottom moved. As she yanked harder, the floor of the vat lifted a few inches. It was made of wood, which had been covered with a gray plaster to look like stone. Before Nancy could lift it higher, she heard footsteps outside. Quickly, she dropped the bottom and closed the vat. She had just time to grab a tin cup and hold it under the stream of water before the wooden door opened and Nancy turned and saw Shorty standing there. For a moment he was speechless with surprise. Well, he exclaimed, you're sure up mighty early, miss. Yes, I am, Nancy said with a smile, then excused herself and left the spring house. As she strolled off, she could feel Shorty's eyes on her. Nancy knew that the ranch hands rose early. Did Shorty intend to get a drink of water, or did he see me go in and come to find out what I was doing? Excited by her discovery in the spring house, Nancy could hardly wait for her friends to awaken so she could tell them all about it. At the news, George sat up straight in bed. That's something, she exclaimed. You found the secret entrance to the cellar. I think so, Nancy replied. It was still kind of dark, and I raised the bottom of only a few inches. There just might be a hidden compartment under the false floor. Let's not tell anyone till we're sure. Bess said, good idea. The girls dressed in jeans and shirts, hoping to investigate the mysterious vat very soon, but at breakfast, Foreman Sanders ruined the plans. 2 of the men will be working on the pump most of the day, he announced. It hasn't been right since the damage was done. Before the meal was over, Nancy asked with a smile, who locked me in the back room last night by mistake? There was silence in the kitchen. Nancy learned nothing. No one wore a guilty expression. In mid-morning, Raleigh asked the 4 girls if they would like to go with him to Tumbleweed. They all accepted eagerly and piled into the ranch wagon with Dave at the wheel. On the way, Uncle Ed told him he was going to the stockyards to pick up a dozen fine palominos for breeding. He had ordered and paid for the horses sometime before. It's a big investment, he frowned. I just hope nothing happens to them. Dave drove straight through the town and parked on the outskirts in the front of the stockyards. As Nancy got out of the car, she noticed a sign on the fence. Tumbleweed, Rodeo, Barbecue, and Square Dance, Saturday. Dave called her aside. Will you go to the barbecue and square dance with me? Surprised, Nancy hesitated for a moment. Please do, he asked earnestly. Bess and George promised Tex and Bud they would go. We can make it a triple date. Okay, thank you, she replied. Good, he said, then excused himself and hurried to the stockyard after Uncle Ed. Meanwhile, the girls walked around the enclosures looking at all the animals. The visitors were attracted to a small corral where a man was offering a trained horse for sale. The girls walked to the fence and joined the cowboys and ranchers who were watching the little chestnut mare perform. Her master stood in the center of the ring and gave various whistles in response. The horse pranced, reared, and kneeled. At the final whistle, the mare ran to him and took a piece of sugar out of his hand. Isn't she darling? Bess murmured. As the girls strolled away, they saw Dave near one of the horse enclosures. Nancy asked him if she had time to take Bess, George, and Alice to Mary Deer's shop. Sure, he replied. Go ahead, we'll pick you up in the ranch wagon. The girls walked down the street, turned into the gift shop. A tall man was standing at the counter talking to Mary. As he turned around, Nancy stopped short in surprise. He was the man in black she had seen near the shop after the attempted robbery. Mary greeted the girls warmly, and Nancy introduced Bess, George, and Alice. The Indian girl presented the tall man as Mr. Diamond, one of her best customers. He smiled at Nancy smoothly. Miss Drew, I congratulate you. Mary tells me she has given you that pretty little antique watch, which I have had my eye on. For weeks she'd been refusing to sell it to me. Mary spoke up. I told Mr. Diamond the history of Valentine and his treasures, she said. Ever since then, he has been most eager to have Francis Humber's watch. Mr. Diamond gave a deep chuckle. I like to collect mementos of the romantic Old West. Do you live around here? George asked. No, ma'am. I'm spending the summer in this area for my health, staying at the Tumbleweed Hotel. Mary smiled. Mr. Diamond spends most of his days riding horsebacks in a mountain for exercise. Nancy's thoughts went to the man in the black hat as she glimpsed in the ghost town, the one who perhaps had caused the rock slide. Had it been Mr. Diamond? Nancy thought it possible because of his knowledge of the treasure. After chatting for a few minutes, Mr. Diamond said, Well, goodbye now, girls, and left the shop. While the others selected a few souvenirs, Nancy took Mary aside and asked her if she had heard from the artist, Mr. Bursey. When Mary said no, Nancy added, If you do, please phone me right away. Mary promised she would. Dave pulled up in the wagon, so the girls hurriedly paid for their purchases and left. The horses are going to be delivered this afternoon, Uncle Ed said, with satisfaction as they drove back to the ranch. They're first-rate animals. The ranch wagon arrived home just as Miss Thurman was ringing the triangle for lunch. Nancy wondered how she would endure the long afternoon waiting for darkness so she could investigate the vat in the spring house. Her attention was distracted, however, by Vans bringing the new horses. The girls and Aunt Bet went outside and watched them run the palominos into the big meadow. Nancy hurried to the fence for a closer look. Oh, they're just beautiful, she cried out. Dave, who was on horseback beside the meadow gate, agreed. They're just the way they should be, the color of the minted golden coin. The last one, a little mare, trotted into the enclosure. Dave wheeled beside her and herded the pony to the fence. Want to pet her? He asked Nancy. With a smile, Nancy stroked the sleek rose of the palomino. The mare nickered and shook her head. Dave laughed. Okay, little lady, he said, on your way. He slapped the pony on the rump, and as she ran off to join the others, with a wave at Nancy, Dave rode off. She admired the confident way he did his job, and his kind, firm manner with the animals. "I do hope he's not mixed up in the mystery," she sighed. As soon as it was dusk, Nancy hurried to the stable and saddled her mount in case the phantom horse should appear that night. Then she asked Bess and George to join her and investigate the spring house. Bess inquired if they were going to take Alice along. "She's writing letters in her room," George said, not knowing exactly what lay ahead of them. Nancy thought it was wise to leave the younger girl behind. When it was dark, she took her flashlight, and the three girls hastened to the spring house. They went inside and closed the door. Nancy turned on her light, raised the vat lid, and with a heart thumping, pulled up the false bottom. A deep hole slanted inwards. While George held the light, Nancy lowered herself into it and felt her foot touching something solid. She kicked lightly as a wood panel moved. In a few moments, she dropped onto an earthen floor. She was in the cellar. Through the hole came Bess. She landed with a thud. From above came the noise of a vat lid closing. A moment later, George appeared in the cellar with her flashlight turned off. For a moment, they stood listening. A shiver ran up Nancy's spine. She thought she could hear someone breathing in the darkness. Quietly, Nancy took the flashlight from George and turned it on. The sweeping beam caught a crouching figure in the corner. Dave Gregory. Bum, bum, bum. So, we think Dave might like Nancy because he did what? He invited her somewhere. To a dance, right? But they go in, they meet Mr. Diamond, who's the guy in black. And he seems very suspicious. And they finally got to investigate the false bottom of the floor, which led to the where? The cellar. So, and when they were there, they thought they heard someone, Nancy heard someone breathing. She took a flashlight, shone it, and she found who crouching in the corner? Dave Gregory. Okay then. Next chapter is called Chapter 11, A Rewarding Search. Dave rose to his feet. "Well, Nancy, you caught me fair and square." She noted the spade at his feet. It looked as though her suspicions about Dave had been right. "Are you digging for treasure?" she asked coolly. "Yes," he said, "but I'm not pulling the phantom trick and causing the damage around here. Please believe me, Nancy. Let me tell you the story." George advised it had better be good. Dave said, "My brother and sister and I are the only remaining descendants of Francis Humber. I was born in Buffalo, New York, but our family moved to Phoenix when I was 10. We have Valentine's original will and had always known the story of his treasure, but never bothered to hunt for it. However, since my father's death 2 years ago, things have been hard with us. I've been working my way through college, but will need more money to help educate my younger brother and sister, so I decided to take a summer job on Shadow Ranch and look for the treasure." "How amazing," Bess murmured. Dave reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. In the beam of her flashlight, Nancy saw that it was a faded photograph of a pretty woman. She also noticed the corner was torn, and the picture was just the right size to fit into the watch case. "This is Francis Humber," she announced. The cowboy looked surprised. "How did you know?" Instead of replying, Nancy asked where he had obtained the picture. He exclaimed that after Francis Humberdale's death, her friend in Tumbleweed, Miss Phillips, had removed the photograph from the watch and sent it to Francis' children in the East. It had been handed down in our family since then. Dave turned the picture over, and on the back the girls saw the word cellar, written in the old-fashioned script. He told them that the tradition of his family was that the cellar was the location of the treasure. Nancy was excited at this clue, but before telling him about the note in the watch, she asked him why he had not told Ed Raleigh what he was doing. "I was afraid he wouldn't hire me. He might have figured I'd spend all my time searching." The cowboy assured Nancy that he'd done all his treasure hunting in off-duty hours. "How did you know the secret entrance?" Bess asked. "Stories about that have always been known in my family," Dave answered. "Originally, the tree grew thickly around the spring house, and in times of Indian attacks, the occupants would escape by the secret exit into the woods and go hide out on the mountain slope." Dave confessed that he was the prowler who had alarmed Miss Thurman in the kitchen. He had hoped to search for the treasure in the cellar that night, right after his turn on guard duty. But you raised such a rumpus, he said to Nancy with a grin, that I knew it was no use to go on. I sneaked out through the little spring house and came around to the kitchen, a little behind the rest of the crowd. I believe you, Dave, said Nancy, but you must promise to tell Mr. Raleigh first thing in the morning what you've been doing. The cowboy assured her that he would. I'm sorry I was kind of rude to you, girls. I just didn't want you hanging around and getting in the way of my treasure hunt. You were pretty awful, said George, but maybe we'll forgive you. Of course we will, Bess agreed. Nancy smiled at Dave and he chuckled. All along I couldn't help liking you, he said. Nancy reached into her pocket and brought out the antique watch. She showed him how the secret lid opened and the picture of Francis fit perfectly to the torn fragment on the empty side. You're amazing, he said. What a detective. Next, Nancy removed the picture of Valentine and turned it over so that Dave could see what was written on the back. With the word on your picture, we now have a complete message, Nancy said excitedly. Green bottle in cellar, Dave read. Surely the treasure would be too large for a bottle, but perhaps it's a clue to the real thing. That's what Nancy figured, George said, grinning. Let's start digging. For half an hour, Dave dug and the girls probed the loose dirt for a bottle. Suddenly, Bess cried out, I found it! Nancy hurried to her side, pressed in the earth where Bess her fingers touched the neck of the bottle with the cap on it. Dave came over and spaded carefully around the glass. When it was partly free, Nancy said, Wait. She brushed the dirt from the large bottle and shone her light in it. Bess exclaimed in disappointment. The bottle was black. No use bothering with that, Nancy said. We're looking for a green one. This has been lying here for years and gradually becoming covered with dirt. With grim determination, the treasure hunters continued to dig and sift the earth. When they had worked over the whole cellar floor, the four stopped exhausted and sat down. Bess expressed the thought that was in all of our minds. Maybe someone had found it already. Shorty, perhaps, Dave said. I've caught him snooping. He told the girls that he suspected other cowboys of knowing about the secret entrance and of inflicting damage on the ranch. I'm sure he's not working alone either, but who else is in league with him, I don't know. Nancy pointed out that if Shorty and his accomplices had found the treasure, they would have left the ranch by this time. The young detective said, There's another person who might have found the bottle. Frances Humber herself. What do you know of her story, Dave? Only that Dirk Valentine and Frances had met only once on Shadow Ranch. He sent her a message that he was coming, and Frances slipped out of the house through the secret entrance and met him at the spring house. But the law was after Valentine, as usual, and he had to leave the territory. He wrote to Frances, however, during the summer of 1880, but her father intercepted the letter and sent Frances to friends in Montana. Then Valentine probably hid the bottle in the cellar while Frances was away and sent her the watch with the location of the bottle written on the backs of the pictures. That's right, Bess declared. The date on the watch is June 1880. Dave went on to say that Frances must have written to Valentine and told him on what day she would return for the night the outlaw sneaked onto the ranch to see her. But the sheriff and the posse suspected that he would come. They were lying in wait and shot Valentine as he entered the spring house. A few minutes later, the sheriff went to the living room to tell his daughter. He found her lighting a lamp. When he told her that her sweetheart had been killed, she fainted. Oh no, cried Bess. For many weeks she was ill, Dave continued. During this time, her father found the watch and sent her by Valentine and took it. When she was well enough to travel, he sent her to stay with relatives in Buffalo. There she married, had 2 children, and died while still a young woman, he concluded. George sighed. Poor thing. She never had a chance to come back here and hunt for treasure. Suddenly Dave stood up. I must go now, he said. I have to stand watch soon in the East Meadow. Quietly, the foursome left the cellar by the secret entrance and parted outside in the spring house. The girls went to shower and changed their clothes. As Nancy dressed, she mulled over the story David told her. She tried to reconstruct a scene at the ranch house on the night of the outlaw's death. If Frances had returned home only that afternoon, Nancy reasoned, she might not have a chance to look in the cellar for the bottle until that night. No doubt she also knew or guessed that her sweetheart would come to see her at the place they had met before. When the shots were fired, Frances would surely have heard them. Here Nancy came to the part of the story that puzzled her. Maybe Frances Humbert was in the cellar and ran upstairs to light a lamp. But why? It would have been more natural for her to go outside to be with Valentine, but suppose Frances had already found the bottle. the sound of the shots, she dashed upstairs in panic, then found that she still had the bottle in her hand. Of course, she hid it in the lamp. Nancy said aloud. Then when her father walked in, Frances lit the lamp to cover her actions. At the bewildered looks on the faces of Bess and George, Nancy chuckled. Quickly, she told them her new theory. We must ask Aunt Bet if any of the old Humbert lamps are still on the premises. The girls hurried to the living room and found Miss Raleigh seated in the rocker, mending her husband's socks. In response to Nancy's questions, she told her that there was a lot of junk from former owners in the storeroom next to Alice's bedroom. The girls hurried down to the hall and entered the storeroom. Bess switched on the ceiling light. Amidst old trunks, baskets, and barrels, they found a birdcage, a hat stand, but no lamp. On the seat of a broken chair lay a raggedy quilt with something wrapped in it. Nancy carefully unfolded the bed cover and revealed a large oil lamp with a deep, rusty glass well. Bess gave a gasp of excitement, and George said, "If only it's the right one." With anxious fingers, Nancy removed the chimney and the wick. She reached into the well and pulled out a slender green glass bottle. Okay, so what was Dave doing in the basement? He was searching for the treasure. So Nancy was right. He had something to do with the treasure. But he says he has nothing to do with the bad things that are happening. He's looking for the treasure because Frances was his ancestor, his descendant, his kin, family, whatever you want to call it. And he needs the money because he's going to college and he'll need the money to send his brother and sister to college too because his dad died. So they helped him look for, so he showed him the picture which said cellar in it. They come to the conclusion that that picture connects to the picture that Nancy has. They put it together, green bottle in cellar. Then they, what did they, yeah, wow, lost my thought, sorry. They dig, they find a bottle, but it's black, so they're, so he tells the whole story about Frances, which is his family, and the outlaw Valentine, and they're supposed to meet up. And something about the story doesn't make sense to Nancy, so she starts working it out in her head, and she realizes that Frances already had the bottle, so it wouldn't be in the cellar anymore, and she probably hid it in the lamp that she was lighting when her dad came in. So they found the lamp, and they ended up finding the bottle. Alrighty, one more chapter for this video. Let's try chapter 12. It's called Lights Out. What wonderful luck, Nancy exclaimed softly. To think of finding this bottle after all these years. Let's see what's inside it, Bess urged. Nancy put her little finger into the bottle and slid out a curled up paper. Carefully, she unrolled it, then glanced at the signature at the bottom, a bold V and a heart. It's a letter from Valentine's to Frances, Nancy said. The girls crowded close and peered at the faded handwriting. The long dead romance came alive for them as Nancy read aloud. My dear girl, I'm writing this in haste to tell you that I truly love you. Would that we could be married, but the law pursues me, and I doubt that I will live much longer. Too late I am, sorry for my misspent life. How sad, murmured Bess. I want you to have my fortune, the note continued, but many people are seeking it. I know my mail is seized, and I have hidden instructions in this bottle. A little of my booty has been converted to gold and melted down into special pieces, dear Frances, made just for you. I wonder what he meant, said George. As Nancy was about to read on, the ceiling light went out. George gave an exclamation of annoyance. What time for the bulb to go? Wait here, I'll get one from the kitchen. As George felt her way out of the room, and suspicion flashed across Nancy's mind, slipping the letter into her shirt pocket, she said, Come on, Bess, and went down the hall with her friend at her heels, asking what was the matter. In the living room, Nancy saw the shadowy figure of Aunt Bet standing by the table lamp. The lights don't work, she said. At the same moment, Alice's voice came up from the hall. Did someone blow a fuse? Her fears growing, Nancy groped her way to the telephone and picked it up. The line was dead. She ran her hand down the wire. It had been cut. Nancy returned to the living room as George hastened in from the kitchen. No lights there either, she reported. And probably no water, Nancy said grimly. The pump runs by electricity. She went on to say someone had probably damaged the generator or cut all the wires. There was a moment of shocked silence. But why? Alice asked in a frightened voice. I'm afraid our enemies are about to make more trouble. They figure we're helpless without lights or phone. What do you think they'll do? Aunt Bess said anxiously. Nancy said she could not be sure, of course, but she expressed fears about the new Palominos. We must report this to the men on patrol, said Miss Raleigh. They may have yet to know anything about the power failure. Nancy agreed, but we must be very quiet about it. If the gang doesn't suspect we've guessed their plans, we may be able to catch them in act. Nancy suggested that Aunt Bet and Alice keep watch in the house while she and the cousins look for the guards. The three hastened to their rooms and get their flashlights. Don't turn them on, Nancy warned, unless you absolutely have to. The girls walked out. The girls walked out and paused at the edge of the portico. Somewhere in the darkness, men were ready to work more mischief. You two go to the East Meadow and report to Dave, she said. I'll locate the Palomino guard. Be careful, Bess warned. You may find the troublemakers instead. They struck at the pump house before, remember? That's close to the big meadow. That's why I think they won't do it again, Nancy replied. Probably they'll pick on a different place. Good luck. If you run into trouble, yell. George and Bess smelled it into the darkness, and Nancy hurried in the opposite direction. As she gazed over the fence of the big meadow, she could see most of the Palominos standing quietly together near the far end. One or two browsing in the middle, but there was no sign of a mounted guard. Quickly, Nancy circled the stable and the adjoining tack room, but found no one. Puzzled, she looked around the yard to the corral. It was empty. Where was the guard? I must find someone, Nancy thought, but before she could move, there came a loud whining from the stable. Nancy wheeled and hurried to the door, then paused, well aware that it might be dangerous to go inside. She quietly stood listening. Except for the nickering of a restless animal, all was quiet. Nancy stepped in and walked cautiously between two rows of stalls. When she reached the one where her horse stood, it occurred to her that someone might have unsaddled him to prevent her from being the first to go after the phantom. But she found the saddle was still in place. As Nancy walked quietly along the left side of the horse, he whinnied nervously. She murmured reassuringly to him and stroked his head. Then she felt the girth of what sure had been loosened and ran her hand over the bridle. All was in order. She was about to leave the stall when there came a loud whinny from the other end of the stable and the sound of a hoof hitting a bucket. Nancy froze. She heard a footstep. Suppose it was one of the gang. If he finds me, she thought, I'll be trapped in the stall, unable to sound the alarm. Nancy knew she must try to get out of the stable. The footsteps had seemed to be near the excited horse, but exactly where was the intruder now? Nancy slipped out of the stall, hugging the wall, and moved towards the door. The next moment she was seized from behind, and a hard hand stifled her outcry. As Nancy struggled, there came a sharp exclamation, and she was suddenly released. Nancy, said a familiar voice. It was Tex's. Great jumping steers. I'm sorry, are you all right? The cowboy asked anxiously. Shucks, girl, I thought you were one of them phantom gang. Nancy took a deep breath. I thought you were too, she said, and quickly told him her news. The cowboy gave a low whistle. Terrible trouble's coming, that's for sure. Where are all the guards? Asked Nancy. Mr. Raleigh and Walt Sanders have gone down to the valley towards Tumbleweed to watch the road. Mr. Raleigh figured if outsiders are helping to do the damage, they might come partway by car, park it, and sneak into the ranch on foot. If that's how it's done, maybe he and Sanders can nab him. Shorty took an early watch, so he's probably sacked out in the bunkhouse. I'm set to guard the stable area. Tex went on, but I figured I'd be less conspicuous on foot. A while ago, I heard a noise from here, and I came in to check. It was nothing, just Daisy thumping around. She's restless tonight. Who's watching the Palominos? Nancy asked. Bud. He wasn't a few minutes ago. Uh-oh, said Tex. Something's wrong here. He never leaves his post. Come on. The two hastened outside. As they turned towards the meadow, from the far end came a high, weird whistle. The signal for the phantom horse. Tex stopped short, then raced towards the house, shouting the alarm. Moments later, the changing of the iron triangle outside the kitchen filled the night. Nancy, meanwhile, had sprinted to the stable and led out her horse. As she sprang into the saddle, she could see the mysterious glowing steed galloping from the trees into the meadow. It hardly seemed to touch the ground, and it wavered in the wind. I'm going to catch it, Nancy vowed, and spurred her horse to racing speed. Straight ahead lay the meadow gate, but it was closed. Taking a deep breath, Nancy gathered her mount and cleared it. As before, the phantom was heading straight across the meadow. Nancy Nancy rode hard to cut the animal off. She intended to see the phantom's bridle, should it have one, on. In a moment, the aspiration turned and raced down the meadow, straight towards the palominos, shrilly whinnying. It plunged into the mist. Some palominos shied and reared, others ran wild. Nancy's horse, trying to overtake the fleeing phantom, pounded through the scattered group. Suddenly, one of the frightened palominos thundered across her path. Frantically, Nancy tried to pull her own mount aside. Too late. The two horses collided. Nancy flew from the saddle and hit the ground so hard she blacked out. Okay, well, like I said, that's the last chapter for this video. Nancy, the lights went out, and they figured there's sabotage once again. And anytime there's sabotage, there's the phantom horse. So she goes looking for, they all go looking for the guards to talk to her, and she can't find them. She heard somebody in the barn, which means she goes in and she tries to escape. When she hears him, she tries to escape. It's Tex, and he was doing the same thing she was. He heard something going in, but they realized that the person that was supposed to be on guard was Bud, and he wasn't anywhere to be found. And then they heard the whistle, and then what came? The phantom horse. And Nancy said she was going to catch him. So she jumped on her horse, jumped over the gate, like, really fast riding. Problem was, the palominos were scared, and one ran in front of her, and her horse hit it, and she flew off and hit the ground. She hit it so hard that she, what? She blacked out. So, that's where that chapter ends. And we will leave it there. So, I hope you're enjoying the book. It's getting really good, so maybe go back and listen to the whole thing over again up to this point so you can really know what's going on. Otherwise, I will see you at the next video. Bye.